Sup, y'all? This is my second time recording. I deleted the footage the first time. Professional here. Alright, just trust me. But this is JMR Talks. We're gonna get through this video. It's gonna be a quick video. This one we're gonna talk about the foreign policy of Truman, basically, and what happened directly after World War II. Next video we'll talk about Eisenhower and JFK. Cool? Cool. Buckle your seatbelts. We're gonna try and get through this quickly. So, there was, as you guys know, the Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union, and there was no clear reason to the start of the war. The Soviets weren't trusted since the 1917 revolution, and the only reason that they were allies in World War II was really just because they kind of needed to be, not because they wanted to be. It goes back to the whole, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Alright, so although hated, enemies and they hate each other, the US and Soviets agree to help with world peace through the United Nations and the Security Council of permanent members, or the Security Council is created with 5 permanent members, the allies of World War II. The United States, China, the Soviets, Great Britain, France, they're all given permanent membership. Soviets disagree to a plan that basically regulated nuclear energy, and they also disagree to a plan to fund countries that were devastated by the war because they say this plan is too capitalist. Russia, or Soviet Russia, I should say, then goes on to take over territories and countries outside of its borders to protect itself from the West, as they say, known as this great concept of satellite states. Good job, Russia. Not really. Really quickly, some other things is Germany is divided into zones controlled each by, or separate zones, I should say, controlled by the US, Soviet Britain, and France. West Germany was supported through no war reparations because they needed to stabilize Germany for world peace. But Soviet Russia was basically like, nah, we need war reparations and we're going to tightly control East Germany. Cool. So, Truman then goes on to give an Iron Curtain speech in which he installs a go-hard policy on the Soviets, and he also gives a speech that calls for Western democracies to halt the spread of communism. He hires 3 advisors has 3 advisors, I should say, help him with policy. George Marshall is the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson is the Undersecretary of State, and George Kennan is the Soviet affair expert. Kennan says a long-term policy is needed to stop the spread of communism, but Walter Lippmann is a journalist who disagrees with him and says that some governments need U.S. aid and others really just don't. Then the Truman Doctrine is kind of formed, created, whatever you want to call it, in response to 2 different things. One, there's a communist uprising against the Greece government, or the government of Greece, and 2, Soviets are demanding control of a Turkish water route, and the doctrine gives $400 million in aid to the Turks. Now you remember George Marshall, Secretary of State, boom, cool, he gets his own plan in this chapter, woo. Pumped, right? This starts because people fear communism being voted on in the Western democracies, so $12 billion in aid is sent to help these countries recover from the war, and the U.S. offers to send money to the Soviets to get rid of their satellite states, but the Soviets refuse, and the plan works, however, in stopping the spread of communism, but doesn't get rid of Soviet states. Now, the Berlin airlift happens, and this basically starts after the Soviets cut off road access to Berlin, and Truman doesn't withdraw any troops from his side of Germany, but he also refuses to continue with force. So, what does he do? Well, I should also say, road access is the key word here, right? They didn't cut off water access or anything. I guess, does Germany have any oceans? I don't know. You get the point here, right? They didn't stop air access. They weren't shooting down planes. So bombers were sent in to drop supplies, but Soviets eventually opened up the roads in 1949, but this creates a long-term West and East Germanys. As you guys remember, going back from the beginning of the year, Washington's farewell address basically said, hey, maybe don't make permanent alliances. That's a bad idea. Truman breaks this recommendation, and he basically creates NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a team to protect Western Europe from the spread of communism. In retaliation, the Soviets create the Warsaw Pact. Then the National Security Act is created in 1947 in the United States, which creates our three favorite agencies. The CIA, which does CIA stuff, such as CIA stuff such as spy missions and, you know what the CIA is. The Department of Defense, which replaces the Department of War, and the National Security Council, which coordinates U.S. foreign policy. Really quickly, you guys all understand that from 1945 to 1949, the U.S. was the only country to have nukes, but then the Soviets developed their own atom bomb thanks to secrets being sold. So Truman approves the development of hydrogen bombs, which are 10 times, if not more, as powerful, that can wipe out entire cities. Right? The National Security Council recommends the following for the Cold War. They need to quadruple the defense spending so that it equals 20% of GNP. They need to form alliances with non-communist countries, and they need to convince the American public that the arms buildup was needed. Certain people believe that Truman approving the development of a hydrogen bomb only created tensions with Russia even more. Boom, we basically just got through Truman and Russia. Let's go through Truman and Asia. As you guys remember, Asian imperialist tactics were a huge thing. We see this with Japan and China, but those are out the window. They no longer work. A bunch of new countries are being formed, but none of them like the U.S. They resist U.S. influence. Japan, however, goes on to be the U.S.'s biggest ally out of these countries, ironically. This is placed under the control of Douglas MacArthur, who holds war trials for Japanese war criminals and establishes a new democracy system. Japan surrenders Korea and Pacific Islands, and the U.S. withdraws, but keeps military bases there in order to protect Japan from communism. The Philippines as well is now independent, but the U.S. still holds bases there because they're like, we can. And China struggles because, forgive me butchering this name, China's former Nationalist Party leader, Chiang Kai-shek, basically gets into it with Mao Zedong, who runs the Communist Party for control of China, and nationalists lose power because of high inflation and extreme corruption, whereas communism appealed to the idea of communism appealed to poor peasant farmers. Truman sends $400 million in aid to help the nationalists. However, 80% of this aid goes to the communists because the communists kind of controlled everything. Two Chinas after this exist, and the U.S. refuses to support or recognize Communist China. Republicans blamed the Democrats for this happening. Korean War. Soviets occupied the North, the U.S. occupied the South. North Korean army invades South Korea, and then Truman calls for the United Nations Special Forces along with the U.S. Army to contain the North Korean army. The North Korean army basically pushes the U.S. and the UN down to the south in a small peninsula, right? And then the U.S. and UN push back, and then they push back basically to China. China gets scared of this, and they push them down to the 38th parallel. Meetings to resolve who gets North and South begin, but no straight deal is ever made, hence how we have tensions in North and South Korea today. Boom. Now, this was seen as successful in the Democrats and Truman's eyes, but the Republicans are extremely unsatisfied, and they say the Democrats went soft on communism. This leads to the Second Red Scare, in which some effects of this are the Loyalty Review Board is set up, and they investigate federal employees, and more than 3 million of them are either fired or resign. The Smith Act of 1940, which is basically saying no speaking of overthrowing the government, is upheld by the Supreme Court. The McCarran Act passes, which says you cannot support a totalitarian government. They restrict travel and the employment of communists. They create detention camps for subversives. Un-American Activities Committee is created, the HUAC. In 1939, it was made to seek out Nazis, but it's brought back to search for communists. The Second Red Scare causes cultural impact such as the following. Arthur Miller and other Hollywood writers are accused of being un-American because of their films, and loyalty oaths were usually required of workers, and espionage cases are meant to find communists. Here are two examples of those. The Hiss case, in which Whittaker Chambers confessed was a confessed communist and star witness. He works with future President Richard Nixon to lead trials against Alger Hiss, who was a person who helped Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. He denies giving secret documents to the communists, and he's convicted of perjury. Great guy. Rosenberg. Klaus Fuchs admits to giving Manhattan Project secrets to the Russians. The FBI traces this information to a spy ring led by Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The Rosenbergs are felt guilty of treason and thereby executed. Now, Joseph McCarthy, what an interesting guy. He's a senator from Wisconsin, and he used the fear of communism in his campaign. He claims a very specific number, 205 communists continue to work for the State Department, and he rises to power because people are too afraid to call him out on his BS, right? They fear that they'll either be removed, defamed, or arrested, and even Eisenhower doesn't really do anything about this. The Senate and the Army, they have a committee that hosts trials on McCarthy, and he's seen as a bully and a fraudulent. Truman doesn't run for another term because he sees the chances of him winning as extremely unlikely. That's all we have to talk about for Truman and foreign policy. Make sure you watch the next episode. We'll talk about Roosevelt and JFK and their foreign policy. Till then, that's all I have for you guys. Stay tuned. More videos on the way.